I'm Scott Alexander, and I'm here to introduce my explanatory essay about Chapter 76 from Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. This podcast is brought to you by Maimonides Group at yahoogroups.com. Chapter 76 is Maimonides' discussion of Islamic proofs for the incorporeality of God. You'll find my essay in the Files section of Yahoo Maimonides Group in PDF format and in several other places that I'll indicate at the end. Once again, I urge you to read Maimonides' chapter first and only then my essay. I think you'll see the usefulness of having a clear explanatory essay on each of these difficult but rewarding chapters of the guide. My recommendation is always that readers start with Rabbi Michael Friedlander's English translation. For Hebrew readers, I recommend Rabbi Yosef Gefich's Hebrew translation. Both are free online. Why does Maimonides make incorporeality the theme of the first book of his Guide of the Perplexed? Maimonides had ruled that there were four doctrines that believers in any religion worth the name must be able to secure for themselves: that God exists, is one, incorporeal, and created the universe from nothing. With this rule, he achieved, in my view, two unstated purposes. Using this rule, he excluded other monotheist religions, such as Islam and Christianity, which he thought failed to sufficiently secure his four requirements. Secondly, he hardened the Jews against accepting, however unconsciously, the doctrines of the Islamic theologians. Now, if I were to ask you to come up with such a list of the requirements for religion, and if you were a monotheist, you might agree on the first two doctrines, that God exists and that God is one. Maimonides only thought monotheist religions were worthy of the name. You might, however, quibble with his other two requirements of religious belief: divine incorporeality and creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. Philosophers, for example, had denied that the world was created. They thought that the notion of ex nihilo creation was incomprehensible. For that reason, Maimonides devotes a large part at the beginning of Book 2 of the Guide to making the case for creationism. But incorporeality was also surrounded with doubts. That's why he concludes Book 1 on this theme of incorporeality. It really is what the entire first book of the Guide is about. Even among monotheists, doubts arose when believers encountered scriptures that seemed to cast God in physical form. So, for example, the Quran depicts Allah as standing or sitting. Sometimes God seems to share human attributes, such as rage. On a higher level, God and man appear to share the so-called essential attributes of wisdom and power. Maimonides addressed the serious problem of essential attributes in detail in the first book of the Guide in chapters 51 through 60. Maimonides' final formulation there regarding the attributes was that God was wise, quote, but not in virtue of wisdom. God's wisdom is completely different from ours. By this he meant to exclude the thought that the attribute of wisdom, the Word of God, the Logos, was a real eternal attribute in or with God. This would exclude the attribute of wisdom incarnated in the eternal uncreated Jesus, as suggested in the beginning of the book of John, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word," and so on. But it would also exclude the Word of Allah, liberated, to use Harry Wolfson's term, as opposed to incarnated, in the eternal uncreated Quran. Maimonides thought that if God were composed of several real eternal elements, God would be corporeal. But let's think about that for a moment. How is it even possible for God? How is it even possible for intangible things to be corporeal? The answer is that even beyond such things as the air that are difficult to touch, Maimonides and his tradition were prepared to pronounce as corporeal the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, which accompanied the Israelites in the desert, as well as the invisible spheres and even the light that appears in the visions of the prophets. The only real difference between the incorporeal world and the world of corporeality is that the latter is always subject to numerosity, while the former is always unified in what I call the unity of mind. This is a non-numerical unity, not preceded by 0 or followed by 2. Numerosity is the marker for corporeality. The earliest Muslim theologians, or Kalām, known as the Mutazilite Kalām, or Mutazila, recognize the equation of numbers and physicality. However, their successors, the Asharite Kalām of Maimonides' time, had long since driven out the Mutazilite anti-attributists. The Asharite Kalām embraced the existence of eternal attributes like wisdom, will, or power in or with God. In Judaism, similar problems of incorporeality existed, which should not be surprising, since Jewish scripture also features anthropomorphisms, both sublime and gross. Maimonides spends the first 40 chapters of the guide, what we call his lexicon, explaining the right way to interpret them. Before his time, mystics produced the Shiur Koma literature, that is to say, the literature of divine bodily measurements, in which God, or perhaps his emissary, was extolled in mind-numbingly immense descriptions. Gershom Scholem, in his famous Major Trends of Jewish Mysticism, thought that we shouldn't take these Shiur Koma works at face value as actual physical descriptions of God, as their effect was just to stun the reader to more readily accept divine inspirations. Nonetheless, having all these examples of physical descriptions of God in the back of his mind, Maimonides ruled in Mishneh Torah that a person who believed in one God but thought that he was corporeal would have to be pronounced a heretic. Others did not agree. His contemporary antagonist, the Ravid, Rabbi Avraham ben David, scoffed that other rabbis, quote, even greater than Maimonides, had been corporealists. So we could see how murky this issue had become. It was not obvious to the Ravid or others that one of the 4 necessary requirements of religion should be the demonstration that God is incorporeal. Another problem for Maimonides was that when he searched Judaism's resources for Loctite arguments for his 4 requirements of religion, he was unable to find them. Why was this? He explained that they'd been lost during the long, cruel tyrannies that the Jews suffered under the Gentiles, except for what he called a few kernels concealed in the Talmud. Even Jewish lore on this matter, as you might find in Rabbi Saadia Gaon's Book of Beliefs and Opinions and Rabbi Bachya ibn Pekuda's Duties of the Heart, came, according to Rambam, from the Islamic theologians. We recognize even now that at the very least there were mutual repercussions, to use another Wolfsonian word, between the rabbis of the so-called Jewish Kalām, like Rabbi Saadia and Rabbi Bachya, and the Mutazila Kalām theologians. What's more, those Muslim thinkers themselves got their clumsy proofs from the early church in its struggle against the Neoplatonic pagan philosophers. That struggle was well depicted in the street scenes in the movie Agora. But this would not do. Better arguments were needed. Maimonides shows in these last chapters that the arguments of those theologians, and especially the later ones, were bad arguments. Theology failed to establish the four requirements of religion because of its failed methodology, but even more so because it failed to grasp the arguments or the intentions of its philosophical opponents. What Maimonides does is to force the theologians into a real debate, taking us back in thought to that early debate in the Greco-Roman agora of their intellectual metropolises like ancient Alexandria. To accomplish this, he creates a figure that he can act through as devil's advocate for the pagans in their debate with the theologians. Arguing on behalf of corporealism is obviously a task Maimonides hates, but the situation demanded it. He created a figure that never existed, who I call Maimonides corporealist, to fight the theologians, to reveal the emptiness of their arguments against divine physicality. He showed that if you were to follow the theologians, his corporealist could easily destroy your arguments. That would leave you no alternative but to believe that God had a physical body, and Maimonides would call you a heretic. But Maimonides recognized two flaws in corporealism that the Kalām theologians never grasped. First was a psychological discovery. Maimonides understood that the heretic imagination inevitably leads to idolatry, and that includes their heretic imaginations on any of the four requirements of religion. The equation of imagination and idolatry emerged from his clear recognition that the imagination could only feature corporeal images. The imagination can never conceive an intellectual concept unless there's some physical exemplar to go along with it. Maimonides wants to liberate the intellect from the chains of the imagination. This was the keynote and special achievement of Israel in their long struggle against idolatry, which is, after all, nothing other than the deification of images. The second flaw in the meaning of corporealism was less explicit, but nonetheless also at the back of Maimonides' mind. The real reason for the tenacity of Maimonides' corporealist was that the ancient world could not accept a transcendent God. This fault also flowed from the dominance of the imagination, which could not conceive such an imageless thing as the God of Abraham and Moses. God, or the gods, were part and parcel of the pagan eternal universe. All had their special roles to play in keeping the vast structure of the Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmos spinning. The crux issue here, of course, is creation ex nihilo, for as the ancient motto had it, nothing can come from nothing, ex nihilo nihil fit. Creation from nothing is an intellectual concept for which no image whatsoever exists. It simply cannot be imagined. Among the philosophers, only the Neoplatonists featured a sort of creative God. Though they didn't believe in creation ex nihilo, they conceived that God could emanate the world from himself. But this was also because a mutual relation between creator and created should exist, such that if the world were corporeal, God ought to be corporeal also, and that he created, or rather unfolded, or emanated, the world out of his own divine body. The Jews, by contrast, recognized that a truly creative God could only be a transcendent God, completely unlike anything in the universe. The problem with the Kalām was that theology had no clear understanding of the dangers of the imagination or of the meaning of divine transcendence. So the Kalām theologians' three arguments against corporealism that Maimonides summarized and systematized here were mechanical contraptions easily dismantled in the clear thinking of his corporealist. The first Kalām argument against divine corporeality was the Atomist dilemma, that if God were corporeal, he had to exist in either one atom of his physical body or in the rest of the atoms of the physical body. But if he existed in only one atom of his physical body, all the rest of the atoms would be superfluous. But the problem is that Kalām doctrine held that no single atom could exist on its own, but only if it were clumped together with other atoms. And that was because, according to Atomist doctrine of the Kalām, a single atom did not possess extension or dimension. It really wasn't in and of itself corporeal and didn't become an extended or a dimensional thing, or a corporeal thing for that matter, unless it clumped together with other atoms. So there was no such thing as a single Kalām atom, and therefore God could not exist in one atom alone of his physical body. But on the other hand, if God were in all the rest of the atoms of the body, or in some number of those atoms, God would manifest himself in each of those atoms as a separate God. But both sides came into this discussion, both the Kalām and the corporealist, admitting and agreeing to being monotheists, so that it wouldn't work to have multiple gods showing up out of this one single physical body. Therefore, neither alternative could work, and the Kalām argued that this proved that God could not exist in a physical body and did not have one. The corporealists' answer was that he wasn't an atomist, just as Maimonides and Aristotle weren't atomists. He could reply that the Atomist Dilemma was irrelevant to anyone who thought that substances were composed of matter and form rather than of atoms. The second Kalām argument was the incomparability argument, that if God were corporeal, he would have to be like every other material thing. Since he shared their corporeality, he could not be unique, and therefore could not be God. The corporealist merely replied that his God's physical body was unlike all other physical bodies. Since his corporeal God was unique, he was able to evade the force of the Kalám's incomparability argument. The third Kalām argument was the particularization argument, that a corporeal God must have a particular shape, since all physical bodies have a particular shape. A second God would have to choose that particular shape out of a range of possible shapes, and the shape of the second God would itself have to have been particularized by a third God, and on in a vicious infinite regress. But this would also be absurd. The Kalām concluded that God could not have a shape, and therefore could not be corporeal. The corporealist's answer, similar to the last one, was that the shape of God's divine body was absolute, necessary, and not contingent, unlike all the other contingent creations. That uniqueness was why the corporealist's God was divine, and why it required no particularizer. The shocking result was that the corporealist had shattered the best arguments of the theologians. There was one argument that the corporealist had no defense against. This was the argument against composition. It was Maimonides' own argument against corporeality, although he acknowledged that he received it from the philosophers. The composition argument was that God could not be composed of two or more elements. All corporeal things must be composed at the very least of matter and form, because all material substances constantly change, and yet some element must remain, the unchanging substrate supporting all those changes. Whatever this substrate may be, we're going to call it matter. The continuous identity of all physical substances amidst their changing forms depends on matter supporting those forms. It remains through all the changes in the form of the substances. That's why physical substances are always composed of at least two things. But since God doesn't change, he requires no material substrate to preserve his identity against change. God is always one, never two, never changing. Divine unity, therefore, requires no higher compositor. That is why God must be incorporeal. But Maimonides disqualified the Kalām theologians from ever using this one argument that actually works, the composition argument, because they had embraced the existence of numerous real, eternal, divine attributes in or with God, such as wisdom and power. So, for example, the Quran represents divine wisdom, the Word of God, which appears as an uncreated, real attribute, eternally with Allah as partner. So the God of the Kalām, like the corporealists' God, would be in need of a higher God to compose its parts, its attributes, its partners, and its modes, and that higher God would in turn be in need of a higher God who could compose its many parts, and this would go on and on again in a vicious regress, and therefore was absurd. Divine unity requires no higher compositor. It's simple in a way that nothing else that we know of is simple. It followed that God could never be associated with multiple real divine attributes. So while the corporealist was able to defeat the Kalām theologians, only the philosopher's composition argument could defeat him. With this historic defeat of theology, we come to the final problem at the end of Book 1, the question of the significance and necessity of philosophy for religion. The effectiveness of the philosopher's composition argument and the failure in the last three guide chapters of the Kalām theologians to secure any of the four requisite doctrines of religion showed that philosophy must rescue religion from the crisis in theology. The question that Maimonides briefly and subtly raises at the end of chapter 76 is whether religion can justifiably turn to philosophy to secure the four foundations of religion. What we see at the end of Book 1 of the Guide and at the beginning of Book 2 is that philosophy had proofs for the first three foundations: divine existence, divine oneness, and divine incorporeality. What I tried to explain from both Maimonides' few words here and from one of his minor works, a collection of rabbinic questions and answers, is not only can religion turn to philosophy, but that it would be halachically and possibly talmudically justified to do so. Based on that conclusion, Maimonides comes back fighting in Book 2 against the most serious commitment of philosophy and of his corporealist, that the world was not created, their claim that the world is eternal. In Book 2, he shows that Aristotle never proved this premise. Maimonides concluded that in the precisely balanced contest between unprovable eternalism and unprovable creationism, religion had sufficient justification to rely on the evidence of scriptural prophecy to support creation ex nihilo. At the end of my chapter essay, I return to the question of the provability of one of those tenets, the most important one, the proof for the existence of God. I address the fact that in those days, the reason that the philosophers believed in God's existence was that they thought that there must be a greater force to maintain the eternal motion of the spheres, and that force could only have been the supreme incorporeal power, which was the God of Aristotle. To be sure, Aristotle's God was not transcendent. It did not create the universe, but was wholly part and parcel of it. It was within the universe. Nonetheless, Maimonides saw that there was a splendid balance between the philosopher's eternal unmoved mover on the one hand, and the Torah's creator of the universe on the other. Even if you were like the philosophers and did not accept creation, God would still exist for you. For this reason, Maimonides said that he could provisionally accept eternalism, despite that he didn't believe in it, for the sake of his argument, because of the paramount importance of first securing the existence of God for both sides, Jerusalem and Athens. Maimonides could put off the issue of creation to deal with later in Book 2. My argument is that his real intent in the guide was the revival of prophecy in Israel, that the guide was his textbook for the training of prophets. At the center of the guide, from after the middle of the second book, he turns his attention to prophecy. I will explain in its place why he does so when we get to those chapters. The first book of the Guide of the Perplexed is where Maimonides awakens the future prophet from the slumber induced by the false gods of the imagination. He provides the prophet the tools to secure the foundations of religion. All of this liberates the prophet for his mission, the transcendent meeting he seeks with the divine, mind to mind, his only desire and his sole purpose in his prophetic quest, irrespective of the benefits it can be expected to shower on us all. I hope you've enjoyed this brief video podcast, my first, the previous ones having been spoken word podcasts. And I hope you'll go on to read Maimonides Chapter 76 in the first book of the Guide of the Perplexed, since I've only touched the summits of this chapter. You'll find my essay in the files section of the Yahoo Maimonides group, as well as several other locations listed in the end note to this video and in the comment field below. It should answer any questions you have from seeing this videocast, as well as any that may occur when you read his Chapter 76 in the Guide of the Perplexed. Thank you very much for listening. You may contact me directly at scottmalexander@rcn.com with comments, questions, or criticism. I would like to thank the Skokie Library for having provided the equipment on which this video cast was recorded, and I also want to thank Mr. Tuvia Miller, who engineered and produced this project.